John Parker's life had been quiet since his wife Melanie passed 5 years earlier. He spent most of his days working on small projects around his modest ranch-style home in Springfield, Missouri. The house sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by open fields and the occasional cluster of oak trees. It was a simple life, the kind that left plenty of time for thinking and for loneliness to creep in the day. Everything changed. Started like any other. John was sitting at the local diner, a place where he and Melanie used to share Saturday morning pancakes. He sipped his coffee, lost in thought, when a headline in the day-old newspaper caught his eye. Local tragedy. Claims young parents 2 children left behind. He read the article twice. Caleb, 10, and Mason, 7, had lost their parents in a car accident just outside of town. No close relatives had stepped forward to claim them, and they were now in the foster care system. John set the paper down, staring out the window at the diner parking lot. A heavy ache settled in his chest. Not the kind that passed quickly. He thought of Melanie's words spoken so many times when they dreamed about having kids. If we can't have our own, maybe we're meant to help someone who needs us. Her voice seemed to echo in the room, even though she was long gone. 2 weeks later, John sat in his lawyer's office, adoption papers spread across the desk. It was a decision he'd never expected to make. But once the idea took root, there was no turning back. He wasn't just adopting 2 boys. He was opening his home and heart to a future he couldn't fully predict. As he signed his name on the dotted line, the lawyer. An older man with gray-in hair glanced at him with a raised brow. "You know, folks around here are going to talk," he said. "You sure about this?" John's hand paused briefly, then continued writing. "Let them talk," he replied firmly. By the time he walked out of the office, the paperwork complete. John felt a mixture of fear and resolve for the first time in years. He wasn't just existing, he had a purpose. The first meeting with Caleb and Mason took place in the children's home, a brick building on the outskirts of Springfield. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and cafeteria food, and the soft hum of children's chatter echoed down the hallways. John sat in a plastic chair, his hands resting on his knees, as he waited when the boys finally walked in. John stood. Caleb, the older brother, entered. First, his dark, cautious eyes scanned the room before landing on John. At 10 years old, Caleb already carried a heaviness in his posture, as if the weight of the world rested on his small shoulders behind him. Mason clung to his brother's shirt, his steps hesitant at just 7. He looked so small and vulnerable, yet there was a spark of curiosity in his eyes that John couldn't ignore. "Hi, boys," John said, his voice steady despite the nervous energy thrumming in his chest. "I'm John Parker." Caleb didn't reply right away. He studied John as if trying to gauge whether this man was just another in a line of temporary adults. Mason, meanwhile, whispered something to his brother, who gave a subtle nod before stepping forward. "Are you really going to take both of us?" Caleb finally asked, his voice steady but soft. John knelt to meet Caleb's eye level. "That's the only way this works," he said firmly. "You and Mason come as a package deal." Mason peeked out from behind Caleb, his lips trembling for how long he asked, barely audible for good. John answered the weight of his words, sinking deep into the room. "This isn't just for now. I'm here for the long haul. You boys are gonna have a home with me." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise. For a moment, the boys seemed unsure whether to believe him, but then something shifted. Mason let go of Caleb's shirt and stepped forward, his small hand reaching out. John didn't hesitate. He took the boy's hand in his own, feeling the fragility and trust in that simple gesture. The ride home was quiet. punctuated only by the sound of gravel crunching under the truck's tires. Caleb and Mason sat close together in the back seat, their small backpacks clutched tightly. John glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his chest tightening with a mix of protectiveness and uncertainty as they pulled into the driveway. Mason spoke for the first time since leaving the children's home. "It's big," he said, looking at the house. "It's home." John replied, simply. He led the boys inside, showing them their shared bedroom. It was small but cozy, with matching twin beds and a window overlooking the backyard. Caleb set his backpack down carefully, his eyes scanning the room, while Mason immediately sat on one of the beds, bouncing slightly on the mattress. John cleared his throat. "Listen, I know this is all new and maybe a little scary." He began, his voice low and steady. "But I want you to know something important. This isn't temporary. This is your home now, and I'll be here for you, no matter what." Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment John thought he might push back, but then the boy gave a small nod. Mason, meanwhile, whispered, "Promise. I promise." John set his voice firm. In that moment, he knew he'd made the right decision. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The first few weeks tested John in ways he hadn't anticipated. Caleb and Mason had been through more in their short lives than most adults could imagine, and it showed Caleb kept his emotions locked tight, rarely speaking unless asked a direct question. Mason, on the other hand, was full of nervous energy, prone to sudden tears or bursts of laughter that seemed more like a defense mechanism than genuine joy. Then there was the town. Springfield wasn't the kind of place where secrets stayed buried. Whispers started almost immediately at the grocery store. A neighbor glanced at John's shopping cart filled with snacks and kids' cereals. Her expression, equal parts surprise and judgment. At church, the congregation buzzed when John walked in with the boys, their young faces standing out against a sea of familiar ones. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into more overt acts. The hardware store suddenly didn't have the paint John needed for the boys' room. A local diner mysteriously reserved every booth. When John and the boys stopped in for breakfast, he heard murmurs at town council meetings where people spoke in coded language about unconventional families and preserving the community. One afternoon, Caleb and Mason were playing basketball in the driveway when an older couple walked past, their eyes narrowing at the sight. The man muttered something to his wife, loud enough for Caleb to hear. "He'll regret it," he said. John, who had been cleaning tools in the garage, stepped outside just as Caleb froze mid-dribble. The boy's face was carefully blank, but John saw the tension in his shoulders. He walked over, placing a firm hand on Caleb's shoulder. Don't! Voice steady. Some people talk because they don't know how to think you're here because you belong here. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Caleb nodded. But John could tell the boy was struggling to believe it. Nighttime was the hardest. Mason had nightmares, vivid, terrifying ones that sent him running into John's room in tears the first time it happened. John sat with him on the edge of the bed, his arm wrapped protectively around the boy's trembling frame. Was it about the accident? John asked gently. Mason nodded, burying his face in John's chest. "I miss them," he whispered. "I know you do," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's okay to miss them. It's okay to feel sad. But I'm here. Now. Mason, you're not alone." Mason clung tighter to him, and for the first time, John felt like he was beginning to break through the walls the boys had built around their hearts. "Caleb, however, was a different story. The boy carried himself with a quiet toughness that made it hard for John to know what he was feeling one evening as John worked on fixing a broken step on the porch. Caleb approached him, holding a small wooden box. "What's this?" John asked. Wiping his hands on his jeans, Caleb hesitated before handing over the box. Inside were photographs, a mix of family pictures and candid snapshots of his parents. "I don't want Mason to see these yet," Caleb said, quietly. "He's not ready." John nodded carefully, closing the box. "You're a good big brother," he said. "You take care of him." Caleb shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Pride. Maybe it's just what I do, despite the struggles. There were small victories. Mason started laughing. More real laughter. The kind that filled the house with warmth. Caleb, ever serious, showed interest in John's carpentry projects, watching intently as John explained how to sand and stain wood. The boys were healing slowly, but surely John knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Spring came early that year, bringing warmer days and brighter skies. John saw it as a chance to get the boys involved in the community. Despite the skepticism that lingered around town, he signed them up for youth sports, Caleb for basketball and Mason for soccer, and decided they'd all pitch in at the upcoming town clean up day. The first game day didn't go as smoothly as John had hoped. Caleb, wearing his freshly issued basketball jersey, walked onto the court with his team, only to be met with stares from the parents. On the sidelines, John noticed some of them whispering, their gazes darting from Caleb to him. The game started, and Caleb's talent quickly became evident. He was fast, precise, and completely focused by half. Time even the most skeptical parents had to admit the boy was good. Still, the air felt thick with tension. After the game, as Caleb walked off the court, John saw one of the other parents approach him. The man, wearing a baseball cap and a skeptical expression, extended his hand. "He's got real talent," he said gruffly. "You must be proud." John shook his hand firmly. "I am. He's worked hard." It wasn't a complete thought, but it was a start at the town cleanup day. Things took another step forward. Volunteers gathered in the town square, armed with brooms, garbage bags, and gloves. John and the boys joined a group assigned to repaint the gazebo as they worked. Mason's chatter filled the air, drawing smiles from a few older volunteers. "Mr. Parker," one woman said, wiping her hands on her apron as she took a break. "Mason's got a way of making work feel a little lighter. He's a bright kid." "He is," John replied, watching Mason laugh as he tried to paint a straight line on the gazebo railing. Caleb, more reserved, worked diligently beside him, his strokes even and precise. As the day went on, more people began to engage with the boys. Caleb demonstrated his knack for carpentry when he fixed a wobbly bench, earning a nod of approval from one of the older men. Mason, meanwhile, managed to organize a small group of kids to help clean up trash around the park. By the end of the day, the atmosphere had shifted. People were no longer just tolerating John and the boys. They were starting to see them as part of the community. The real turning point came when Mason entered the town's annual Spring Festival art contest. He spent days working on a painting of his late parents, a heartfelt tribute that captured their love and warmth when he submitted it. John wasn't sure how it would be received on the day of the festival. Mason's painting was displayed alongside others in the town square. People stopped to admire it, their expressions softening as they took in the emotion behind the brush strokes when the winners were announced. Mason's name echoed through the square. The applause that followed was genuine, and as Mason walked up to receive his ribbon, John saw something shift in the crowd. The boys' joy was infectious, and for the first time the whispers of judgment seemed to fade that evening. As they walked home, Caleb spoke up. "It feels different," he said quietly. "What does John ask people?" Caleb replied, glancing back at the square where the festival lights still twinkled. "They're not looking at us the same way." John smiled. "That's because they're starting to see what I see. Two amazing kids who belong here." It started as a distant rumble. Late one afternoon, the kind of storm the local news had been warning about for days by evening, the sky turned a bruised gray, and the winds picked up, bending the trees in John's backyard. Caleb and Mason stood by the living room window, their faces lit with a mix of fascination and fear. "Will it be bad?" Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. John put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Storms can be tough, but this house has stood through worse. We'll be okay." The power flickered, then went out. Completely. John grabbed a flashlight and herded the boys to the basement. The sound of rain pounding against the roof was deafening, accompanied by the occasional snap of branches breaking in the wind. Caleb sat close to Mason, his arm wrapped protectively around his younger brother, when the storm finally passed. John led the boys upstairs. They stepped outside to survey the damage. Shingles scattered across the yard, branches strewn everywhere, and a portion of the fence leaning precariously across the street. A neighbor's roof had partially caved in. The sound of sirens filled the air as emergency vehicles navigated the flooded streets. John took a deep breath and turned to the boys. "Let's get to work." He said, "There are people out there who need help." The next few days were a blur of activity. John and the boys spent every waking hour assisting neighbors with repairs. They cleared fallen branches, hammered plywood over broken windows, and distributed supplies from the community center. Mason quickly became a favorite among the neighbors, his cheerful demeanor providing a sense of normalcy amid the chaos. At one point, he handed a bottle of water to an elderly woman who patted his cheek and said, "You've got a good heart, young man." Caleb, meanwhile, worked quietly, but tirelessly. His focus unshakable, he spent hours helping John patch up roofs and secure unstable structures. One neighbor, a gruff man, who had barely acknowledged John before stopped by to thank them. "You're raising good boys," he said. Simply, "I'm just helping them be who they already are." John replied the storm had brought the town together in unexpected ways. People who had once kept their distance now worked side by side with John and the boys at the community potluck, organized to thank the volunteers. Mason and Caleb sat among their peers, laughing and sharing stories like they'd lived in Springfield their entire lives. When the mayor stood to give a speech, he singled out John and the boys in times like these. "We see the true character of people." He said, "John Parker and his sons have shown us what it means to care for others, no matter the circumstances." The applause that followed was thunderous, and for the first time John felt like the town had truly accepted his family that night as they sat around the dining table eating leftover potluck dishes. Mason looked up at John. "Do you think Mom and Dad would have been proud of us?" he asked softly. John set his fork down, his throat tightening. "I know they would have been," he said, his voice firm. "And I'm proud of you too." Caleb glanced at Mason, then at John. "We're proud of you too." He said the words were simple, but they carried a weight that made John's heart swell. The weeks following the storm marked a turning point for John, Caleb, and Mason. The once closed doors of Springfield began to open, albeit slowly, People who had previously avoided them now waved as they passed, and the murmurs of disapproval gave way to conversations the family's efforts during the storm had left a mark on the town one Saturday. While Caleb and Mason played basketball in the driveway, a car pulled up. It was Mr. Peterson, one of the town's more vocal critics. He stepped out holding a small toolbox. "I heard you're fixing that old gazebo down at the park," he said, his tone awkward. "Thought you might need an extra pair of hands." John hesitated for a moment, then extended his own hand. "We could use the help," he said, that afternoon. Caleb worked alongside Mr. Peterson, sanding the gazebo rails while Mason helped apply a fresh coat of paint by the end of the day. The once dilapidated structure gleamed, and Mr. Peterson stayed long enough to share lemonade with the family on their porch. It wasn't an apology, but it was a step toward reconciliation. The town's transformation extended beyond individuals. Caleb's basketball team had a fundraiser to help families still recovering from the storm, and Mason suggested they donate part of the proceeds to repair the community center's playground when Mason presented the idea to the group. A few kids hesitated. "What if we don't raise enough?" one boy asked. Mason grinned. "Then we'll keep going until we do." The fundraiser was a success, and the sight of Mason handing over a check to the community center director was enough to soften even the hardest hearts. Not everyone was quick to change. At a town council meeting, Mrs. Aldridge, an older woman known for her sharp tongue, stood to voice her concerns. "I still think this is all too much too fast," she said, her words pointed but lacking the edge they once carried. Before John could respond, Caleb raised his hand. The room fell silent as the boy stood. "People can change," Caleb said, his voice steady. "If we can, so can you?" The simple statement hung in the air, and Mrs. Aldridge sank back into her seat, her face thoughtful. The true moment of transformation came at the town's 4th of July. Celebration, the annual fireworks display, was a big event, drawing families from all over Springfield. John, Caleb, and Mason arrived early to help set up chairs and tables. As the sun set, the park filled with people and the air buzzed with excitement when the fireworks began. Mason sat on John's lap, his face illuminated by the bursts of light in the sky. Caleb sat beside them, his expression a mix of awe and contentment as the final firework exploded in a shower of gold and silver. John looked around at the crowd for the first time. He felt like they weren't just tolerated, they were part of the town. Mason leaned his head against John's chest. "We belong here, don't we?" John smiled, his eyes misting. "Yeah, buddy, we do." 10 years passed, and Springfield looked different in many ways. New businesses had sprung up. The once crumbling playground was now a bustling hub of activity, and the gazebo Caleb and Mason had helped restore still stood as a symbol of resilience. But it wasn't just the town's physical changes that mattered. It was the people. John Parker's house had become a gathering place over the years, where neighbors felt welcome and kids came to shoot hoops in the driveway. His sons, now grown men, had carved out meaningful lives for themselves while still carrying the lessons learned in that little house at the end of the gravel road. Caleb, now 20, was studying architecture at the University of Kansas. He often returned home on weekends to help with community projects, his designs bringing new ideas to life. His latest project was a town mural featuring images of the storm and the recovery that followed, honoring the unity that had grown in its aftermath. Mason, 17, had taken a different path. With his natural charisma and ability to connect with people, he led youth outreach programs at the local community center. He worked tirelessly to ensure that kids from all backgrounds had opportunities to thrive, offering mentorship and organizing events that bridged divides on a warm summer evening. the town gathered for a dedication ceremony at the community center. A plaque was unveiled reading in honor of the Parker family for teaching us what it means to be a community. John stood at the back of the crowd, his arms crossed as he watched his son speak. Caleb talked about the importance of building spaces that brought people together, while Mason shared stories about the kids he'd worked with and the difference a little kindness could make when the speeches were over. Caleb found John near the food tables. "We couldn't have done any of this without you," he said. John shook his head, his voice low. "No, son. You both made your own paths. I just gave you the tools." As the crowd dispersed, Mason walked over, carrying 2 plates of pie. "I saved the last pieces for us," he said with a grin. John chuckled, taking a plate. Good to know some things don't change. The 3 of them sat on a bench near the playground, eating in comfortable silence. The sky darkened, and the first stars appeared, twinkling faintly above. "I think Mom would have been proud," Caleb said suddenly, his voice soft. John looked at his sons, his chest swelling with pride. "She would have been, and so am I." For a moment, none of them spoke. The distant sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air, a reminder of how far they'd all come. Caleb and Mason had grown into men of character and compassion, leaving behind a legacy of their own. As the night deepened, John realized that the house he'd built wasn't just a home for 2 boys. It was a foundation for a better future, one that would ripple far beyond Springfield.